this podcast, we will examine the Bayeux Tapestry and the profound changes to English society that it represents. The Bayeux Tapestry was perhaps created by Odo, Bishop of Bayeux and Earl of Kent, who was the half-brother of William the Conqueror, and one of his prominent supporters. The Bayeux Tapestry itself is an impressive piece of medieval art, stretching 230 feet and displaying one of the most profound stories in the history of England, the story of the Norman Conquest. But just as the Bayeux Tapestry gives us the side of the Norman conquerors and the new house of Normandy that would sit upon the English throne for decades, it is critical for a well-rounded perspective on these events to consult the ultimate losers of the conflict and their sources, chief among them the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. When looking at all of the sources put together, the narrative that Duke William had a divine right to the throne and was betrayed by a usurper begins to fall apart. The political and dynastic situation before the events depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry give a clearer picture of why the Normans had to come up with a story on their asserted superior claim to the throne over their rivals. Duke William was the only major candidate to the throne that was a blood relation of King Edward through Emma of Normandy, mother of Edward and great aunt of William. While blood relation to the king presented a claim to the throne, this relation was not strong enough on its own for William, as he had no direct ancestors of the House of Wessex, the traditional occupants of the throne of England. To fill this void, it appears William and his supporters needed a more compelling narrative to keep the Normans in power, and the proclamation of the loyalty of both Edward and Harold to William as heir of England would help secure his reign. While the later Norman sources downplay the extent of resistance to Norman infiltration during Edward's reign, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle sheds light onto the abuse of power the Normans demonstrated during their rise in England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that, after appointments of various Normans to leadership positions, the Earl Godwin expelled them. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that they outlawed all the Frenchmen who before instituted bad laws and judged unrighteous judgment and brought bad counsels into the land. While Norman sources would later reference the expulsion of these officials as a justification for their subsequent invasion, the native English sources give reason for the expulsions and show that the Normans were not as innocent as the later writings portray, contributing to their later propaganda. This brings us to the story displayed on the Bayeux Tapestry itself. While the overall tapestry shows us the Norman side of events that directly preceded the conquest, there is one scene that is perhaps the most emblematic in the entire tapestry, where Harold Godwinson swears upon holy relics and oath to William. After previously campaigning with William, they return to Normandy, and in a subsequent ceremony, Harold is given arms by William, signifying his subservience to him, and in the next scene, Harold himself swears an oath to William on holy relics. This implies Harold is binding himself to support William in the English royal succession, and in previous scenes of the tapestry, it is shown that Edward the Confessor has commanded Harold to do so. This would make Harold's seizure of the crown after Edward's death treachery against not only the will of his sovereign, but also against God himself. This acute propaganda enlisted by the Normans after the conquest is striking in that there is no corresponding account of Edward proclaiming his intentions to leave the crown to the Duke of Normandy in English sources, and no account of Harold being sent to Normandy to declare Edward's will in passing the English crown to William. This can indicate that the oath that was sworn in Normandy was not an event that actually took place, but was instead concocted by the Normans after the fact to justify their rule. After the death of Harold, William, now the Conqueror, was crowned as King of England. The new administration quickly began to produce propaganda to justify and explain their rule, notably in the work of Norman monk William of Jumièges, who compiled the book Gesta Normanorum Ducum, that gives us the Norman version of the events depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry. The chronicle states that Edward, King of the English, lacking an heir, sent Duke Harold, the greatest of all the earls, to swear fealty to William, Duke of Normandy, concerning Edward's crown. Harold remained with the Duke for some time, and swore fealty concerning the kingdom with many oaths, before being sent back to the king laden with gifts. This passage clearly shows that the purpose of this book is to be a source of Norman propaganda in explaining the reason why the House of Normandy had the best claim to the throne, while sidestepping arguments that the English may have made about the validity of his claim. Looking at the various Norman sources on the subject of the conquest, the Bayeux Tapestry seems to give a physical and artistic display of how the Normans thought about themselves and how they justified their conquest of England. While the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other English sources are notable in lacking the recounting of the travel tale of Harold to the Duchy of Normandy, the Normans were sure to make up for this with their accounts, which are replete with the retelling of this story. While it is intriguing to assert that Harold did in fact make the trip to inform William of his state as heir of Edward the Confessor, a more skeptical view of the evidence suggests that it may have been created by the Normans after the fact to justify the rule of William the Conqueror and his descendants over England.